Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you've been waiting a while, thank you so much for your patience while we have been working behind the scenes to get everything ready this morning. I really appreciate you joining us today. And I really appreciate if this is your first time and you've been holding on and just waiting for us to get started, thank you so much for your patience and just thank you so much for joining us today. If you haven't already, please go ahead and say hello in the chat. I know there's been quite a bit of conversation this morning for those of us who have just been waiting. But yeah, go ahead and say hello if this is your first time joining us in the chat today. It's really great to be together. I don't know about you, but I love a good story. Maybe you do too. Maybe you like to read books. You go on holiday and you make sure that you get a couple or you've got some downloaded onto your tablet. You really like a good story. You like to just curl up and you get lost in the narrative. Or maybe you're more of a film person. You like to watch the movies, or maybe you like to watch sort of documentary style things or history programs, or maybe even it's those sorts of shows which are all about like redecorating your house or redoing your garden. But in essence, every single one of those things is actually a story. And they're just good stories to some degree or another. Now, I'd love to know, what was your favorite story growing up? So can you put in the chat for me, please? Put in the chat for us what your favorite story was growing up. If you're watching this on demand, please go ahead and throw it in the comments. Put something in the comments about your favorite story. What was your favorite story growing up? When I was younger, I remember reading the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit trilogies, the Chronicles of Narnia. I really loved the fantastical elements. But also, if I had to tell you what my favorite story was, that was more of a realism story, it was To Kill a Mockingbird. I read that one a few times as a child, and that really impacted me. So what was your favorite story growing up? If you could put that in the chat, that'd be really great. Thank you. Jesus was a massive master storyteller. I don't know if you know anybody like this. Maybe there's somebody in your life, and when you spend time with him, he or she just always tells stories. Did you know out of all the record of the stuff that Jesus taught, over a third of it is a story? A third of everything that we have recorded of him teaching and talking about is actually a story. That's a lot of stories. But his stories were more than just entertainment. His stories were more than just moral fables. They were more than just feel-good tales or sort of things to try to make you behave differently. It was actually a much bigger point. There was always something more going on in Jesus' stories. And if you were listening, really listening, you would find that there was something more going on. You'd realize that Jesus is using everyday moments from everyday life to give you a totally different perspective. You see, a good story makes you think differently. And that different viewpoint sticks with you. You're supposed to walk away and still think about this story. It would play over in your mind as you went throughout your day. Maybe when you sat down that evening and you got ready for eating your evening meal, you'd think about that story and it'd come back to you and you just sort of chew on it a bit more and you'd mull it over. And the more you thought about it, the more you begin to understand what Jesus was really talking about. And when you realize what the story was really about, you begin to think differently. Over the next 3 weeks, we are going to explore one of Jesus's most well-known stories. People call it the prodigal son or the lost son, and others even refer to it as the lost sons. And today is part 1, and each week we're going to build on this story and explore a bit more. So make sure that you join us for all 3 weeks to get the full narrative of this story. Now, this story is more than a story about 2 sons and a dad and broken relationships and wayward sons and all this type of thing. The point of the story is actually so surprising and so subtle that if it sticks with you, it could change your very view of God. This story answers the question, what is God really like? Now, here's how it's important. That's a big question. Whether you follow Jesus or not, this is a huge question. And whether you follow Jesus or not, you likely have an impression or an idea of what you think Jesus or God is actually like. I mean, here's what Richard Dawkins, the well-known atheist and author, says is his perception of what God is like. He is jealous and proud of it, petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, racist, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, maniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. It's a lot of big words there. Your view of God shapes your view of life. Your view of God shapes your view of everything. You might think he's all loving and permissive. He knows you're only human, after all. And you're prone to make mistakes. Besides, he loves the sinner and he hates the sin. He sat down with sinners, but he rebuked and criticized those who were righteous. At the end of the day, he's just so full of love and he knows you tried your best. Your view of God shapes your life. Or maybe you just tend to think more that God's heart is crushed by sin and all the stupid stuff that we do towards one another. You might think sin is no laughing matter. I mean, that's the very thing that caused him to give his life for everyone. It should never be disregarded. It should be treated seriously. And you know that he's loving, but he's not permissive. Your view of God shapes your view of life. Maybe you don't believe in God. And for most people who don't believe in God, they don't believe in their view of God. The way they perceive God is the reason they don't believe in God. It's because you don't accept or agree with the perspective of God that you understand. And if you think God is absent, apathetic, or angry, then you're not going to believe in him. And well done. I would not believe in a God like that either. You see, your view of God shapes your view of life. Whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, your view of God shapes your life. If we think God is angry and vindictive and just waiting to see other people fail and waiting for me to make mistakes, then that is going to change the way I view myself and it's going to change the way I view others. You see, your view of God shapes your view of life. So the best way to learn about God is actually to look at the life of Jesus. What did Jesus tell us about God? Now, when Jesus started to tell us what God was like, instead of facts and information, instead of data points that you can plot on a spreadsheet, he gave us a story. You see, when Jesus wanted to tell us what God was really like, he gave us a story that we can remember and think about, and a story that will stick with us. When you have a story that you remember, you can tell that story to others. If you had to remember all the facts and the information and the data points, you wouldn't remember all the details. But you can remember a story. That's why Jesus told you stories, because he wants us to remember. Another thing about a story is you need to know who your audience is. You know, if the author is writing a book for a bunch of 5-year-olds, it's going to be a very different book to a bunch of 15-year-olds. The audience determines the story. If you're telling a group of a story to a bunch of children, it's going to be very different to if you're telling that story to a bunch of adults. Now, you do this as well. You know, think about this. The last time you texted one of your mates, it was probably different to the way you texted your mom. The audience determines the story. It determines the way you communicate. Jesus knew this. He knew that the audience would determine what he was talking about. The culture determined the story that he was speaking into. He drew into his narratives everyday moments that the audience would understand, and things like fishermen and farmers and women baking bread and gardeners planting seeds or looking for a lost piece of jewelry. There were soldiers and bandits and prisoners and judges. Jesus used people and situations and circumstances that his audience would understand. Now, the story that Jesus told is found in Luke chapter 15. And what's unique about this story is we are actually told at the beginning who the audience is. Luke 15, verse 1, it says that the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and he eats with them." So just before we get into the story, let's look at the context. So here we have tax collectors and sinners, Pharisees and teachers of the law. Now, nobody likes paying taxes. I don't like paying taxes. I'm sure you don't either. The thing about nowadays is it just happens automatically. When you get paid, your taxes go out automatically out of your salary. When you go fill up your car with some petrol, the taxes go out automatically. When you buy stuff in the shops, the taxes are added automatically. You don't get it like sort of selectively on top. Now, for those of you who run a business or you are self-employed, those types of things, you'll know what it's like to have to calculate it and figure it out on top. And in this day and age, everyone had to sort of pay their extra on top. Now, the Jewish people were occupied by the Romans. And the tax collectors were Jewish people that worked for the Romans. I mean, they were turncoats. They were people who sold themselves out. They worked for the Romans, they pocketed the difference, and they were taking advantage of their own people. You hated the tax collectors. It could have been somebody that you went to school with and grew up with. You were great friends growing up, and then your career paths took a little different direction, and he became a tax collector, and you became a shepherd, and you had to pay your taxes to someone that used to be your good friend, and he was taking your money and giving it to the Romans who were controlling your livelihood. They hated the tax collectors. Sinners are those in that culture who just generically refers to people who just didn't follow the rules or go along with the religious tradition or the moral expectations of what were required of you. I'm just going to be me. I'm going to live however I want to live. And they were also looked down on in that society. They were not trying to keep the moral laws or purity regulations. They did not even care about keeping tradition. Now, the Pharisees and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, were those that thought they had God figured out. They were the ones that knew the right things to do, the right ways to behave, and they wanted to enforce it on everybody else. They had it figured out. They would teach others what God expected of you and what they then expected from you. They did everything in their power to keep the moral laws and purity regulations. They cared about keeping tradition. And here they are, muttering to themselves, look at Jesus, welcoming and spending time with these tax collectors and sinners. Here he is, hanging out with these scumbags, these filthy whatevers, Doesn't he know who they are? Why isn't he telling them off? They're not as good as those of us who are doing things the right way. They should be told how bad they are. They should be told how much they are making mistakes. The only reason they're hanging out with Jesus is because Jesus must be watering down the truth, and he's only telling them the things that they want to hear. Doesn't he know that they are unclean and we are the holy ones? No wonder they were annoyed and angry with Jesus. So in response to their attitude and their muttering, Jesus tells a story. He actually tells 3 stories, but we're just going to look at the third one today. Therefore, who's the primary audience in these stories? Jesus is telling these stories to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. They are the primary audience of these stories. Now, you might have heard this story before, and in all likelihood, it focused primarily on the sinners and how much Jesus loved the wayward son. However, the point of the story is to show the Pharisees how their self-righteousness is destroying their souls and everyone around them. Let's get back to the story. It carries on. The third story starts in Luke 15. It's in verse 11. And it says, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger son said to his father, give me my share of the inheritance. So he divided his estate between them. 2 sons. So here's what we've got. 2 sons. If you've heard this story before, most of the focus is on the younger son. But the story is about two sons. We've got two groups of people: sinners and tax collectors, Pharisees and teachers of the law. We've got two ways to live life, different approaches to life and truth. See, Jesus is telling a story that contrasts and highlights two. The sinners and the tax collectors represented those who feel life is better without people telling you what to do. Hierarchical authority and tradition are just barriers to our freedom. It's my life. I can do what I want, and when I want, and with who I want. It's my life. How dare you restrict my freedom? I should be free from the constraints of society, tradition, and religion, and as long as I'm not hurting anyone, I should be free to do whatever I want. This is how I will find my true self and then achieve true happiness. They view others as bigoted and believe that what's wrong with the world is everyone else. And they think their way is the solution. They believe that the deciding factor in life is personal happiness and personal freedom. How I feel and what I think is the most important thing in my life. That's the sinners and tax collectors' view. Now, the Pharisees and tax collectors are those who think happiness and freedom is only achieved through our moral behavior and compliance. You must deny yourself. You have to put aside yourself and serve the will of your God or your community. It has to be higher than your own personal fulfillment. If only everyone would comply, then we wouldn't have any problems in society. They view others who do their own thing and believe that what's wrong with the world is them. They think that their way is the solution. Now, I don't know about you, but these two groups sound a little bit familiar because these same two groups are the same two groups that have been going on forever in society. We tend to put people ourselves into either one of these two groups of life. And in this story, Jesus contrasts these two approaches to life. So the story carries on. It says, the next verse, there was a man who had two sons. And the younger son said to his father, give me my share of the inheritance. So he, the father, divided his estate between them. My share. So to get the estate, it's like he's saying to his dad, look, you're as good as dead to me. You'd be better off dead. The younger son wants his freedom. He doesn't want to enjoy the estate under his father's supervision. He wants to make his own choices, and he wants to do it in his own way. He wants to have control of his own wealth, his own decisions. So he got together all that he had, which he had just been given to by his father. He got together all that he had, and he set off for a distant country, and he squandered all his wealth. After he spent everything, there was a severe famine in the land, and he began to be in need. Jesus throws in this idea of a famine. Now, a famine has happened, and this is the first thing that seems to be out of the son's control. Everything up to that point was dictated by the son, and at this point, a famine happens, and it's out of his control. And most of us prefer to control things, so let's be honest. We don't want or need others' outside influence on our lives. But life doesn't always work that way. It doesn't normally work that way. In fact, something usually happens outside of our control. And it reminds us that we don't really have it all together, or as much as we thought we did. You only hit rock bottom when you've got nowhere else to go. So what does the son do? It says he went and he hired himself out, and he was sent to feed the pigs. He wasn't a family servant that the family looked after. He wanted to make himself like a slave. He went and hired himself out, and he was sent to feed the pigs. And it says he longed to fill his stomach with the food that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. He not only was degrading himself by becoming a slave, a debted slave, he was actually doing the most degrading thing that culturally a Jewish person really could have done: feeding pigs. Pigs were an unclean animal. And yet you're saying that you wanted to eat the food that the unclean animals were eating. Culturally, it would have been a shocking, disgusting story. And if the Pharisees and Pharisees and teachers of the law are listening to this story, and at this point, I bet you they're thinking, finally, Jesus is telling the scumbag the way it really is. These sinners are going to get what they deserved. This son is being punished. He disregarded his father. He wanted his estate. He felt like he was his father was dead to him. He wanted everything. He wanted to control everything. And finally, Jesus is going to pull this son up. And he's reached the point where he feels like he is less than a pig. Except Jesus isn't telling the story as if that's what the son deserved. The son is not being punished. The son is just experiencing a consequence of his choice. It's told matter-of-factly. It's simply a consequence. He was able to make his own choices, and yet his freedom has still left him empty. He's still longing for something. And Jesus isn't saying he's being punished. He's just saying that's a consequence of your choice. And then, when he came to his senses, the son says, hang on, wait a minute. How many of my father's servants have food to spare, and yet here I am starving to death? The word there, servant, is different to the word that he used when it says, I'll make myself a hired person or a hired slave. The servant were those that lived in the household and worked in the household. So he's saying even the servants are treated better. So here I am starving to death. I'm going to go home. But before I go home, I've got to work something out. I've got to figure out what I should say when I get home. So he starts practicing and he's rehearsing and he's working out what he's going to say. He's just kind of figuring it out. He comes up with some ideas. He's like, okay, how about this? Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. Maybe he thought his father was going to be mad and angry with him. The son carries on and he thinks, oh, I'm no longer worthy to be your son. You see, maybe he thought the father would be embarrassed because in a society which is very patriarchal, which means the father was important, in a society like that, what the son did would be incredibly embarrassing. It would be shameful on the family. For your son to treat you like you were dead and disregard everything that you had done is shameful and embarrassing. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Maybe he thought he's embarrassed and I've lost the relationship. I'm no longer able to be viewed as a son. And then he says, make me like one of your hired servants, your indebted slaves. Make me as a hired servant. Maybe he's thinking the only way back, because my dad would be angry with me, my dad is going to be embarrassed of me, and the only way back now is to try to earn his approval. Imagine for a moment that you were the child who left home. Imagine if you weren't sure if you could ever come back. Maybe you feel like you've burned all the bridges. Maybe you feel like the only way you could come back home is if you grovel. You crawl back on your hands and knees and you grovel. Maybe though you would never even consider coming back. If you felt like the response that you would receive would be one of anger or embarrassment, or that you'd have to prove yourself to earn favor, maybe you would never want to come back. And if these were the responses that you expected, would you ever consider coming back home? Or if this was your experience in life, maybe this is how you experienced life. Maybe you had a father or mother, someone in your life who was always critical or angry with you, and you could never, ever make them proud of you. Everything was wrong. You always fell short. No matter how hard you tried, it was never good enough. Or some reason you don't even know why, it was like you were on eggshells because they were always angry with you. Or you felt like they were just embarrassed of you. Or you felt like you had to just do whatever you could to try to earn their approval or their favor. And of course, if you felt like that, would you ever consider coming back home? But we all have a choice. We all have a choice, and this son does consider coming back home, and this son does make a choice. This son decides, I'm going to go for it. And it says he got up and he went to his father. See, life for all of us is a series of choices. You're never forced to come home. You're just invited, but it's your choice. The younger son didn't know what to expect when he got home. He only knew that he was at the end of himself and that his pursuit of trying to figure it all out for himself just didn't work. And it hadn't worked out the way he hoped. I said at the beginning that this is a story of two views or two approaches to life. And this younger son realizes that trying to find oneself through self-fulfillment and throwing off moral constraints of society and tradition, it just hasn't worked out. He's still longing for something. Maybe he thinks he needs to be more like his older brother, the one who kept the rules, the one who always did the right thing, even at personal cost. Maybe that's the way to find fulfillment in life. I imagine that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law are expecting a showdown. The story is about to get really good. Finally, this son has realized the error of his ways. He has realized his mistakes, and he is going to get what is coming to him. He is going to get what he deserves. The father is going to put him right, tell him off, and expect him to prove himself. Besides, it was that son that disregarded everything and chose to go their own way. It was that son that wasted everything that was given. It was that son that chose to just squander all that they had been given. And finally, this son has realized their mistakes. So this is the son that was brought down so low that he considered eating the scraps from pigs. This is the son that represents everything that is wrong with the world, all of the focus on self. See, all of these Pharisees and teachers of the law had this view of what the Father was going to be like. However, the Father wasn't anything at all like they expected. They expected the Father to be angry, embarrassed, and they expected him to earn his way back home. But the Father doesn't do this. He doesn't expect the younger son to be more like the older brother. He does something totally unexpected. He does something totally unexpected. And next week, we're going to carry on with the next part of this story. I wonder who you feel like so far. As we've been talking about this, who do you feel like in this story? Maybe you're like the one who believes that life is better off without people telling you what to do. Or maybe you feel no one else has the right to tell you how to live your life. Nobody. It's my life. Maybe you're like the one who does everything you can to keep all the rules. And you have high expectations of yourself and others. Maybe you've gone far from home. Maybe you know what it's like to leave home. You know what it's like to want to leave. Maybe you have wanted to run away and leave for a long time. You know, wherever you are on your journey in life and faith, I'm going to ask you to make a choice. Life is all about choices. Here's what I'd like to ask you to do. Join us for part 2 and part 3. That's the choice. Just one simple choice that says, I will join for part 2 and part 3. I'm not asking you to do anything else. What I'm asking you now is just join us for part 2 and part 3. This is a great story. This is a good story. And I don't want you to miss any of it. But I'm not going to insult your intelligence. And therefore, I want you to be part of the whole story. I desperately want you to know what God is really like. You might just find that He is totally different to what you expected. You might even find that the God you've turned your back on is worth turning His back on, because the God that you think is absent, apathetic, and angry should be walked away from. And you might just find that God is totally different to all of those things that you expected. We're going to sing a song together now. We're going to take a moment to sing a worship song. And it talks about what God is like. This song talks about God's reckless, overwhelming, never-ending love. This may be your experience because this song is your story. You know, like that son who walked away and wandered away, you know that this has been your story, and you have discovered and experienced the overwhelming, reckless, never-ending love of God. But this might not be your experience. You may not have experienced this yet. Maybe you're still discovering what God is really like. And I trust that as we worship together now, this song will be a song of truth for you. Let's worship together now.
So good. coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. All the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99, and I couldn't turn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. All the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God.
Thank you, Joel and Kevin and the worship team. What a great story to get into. I encourage you to revisit it this week. You can find the book of Luke in the Bible and just turn to chapter 15 to reread that story. A great place to carry on the conversation and discussions about faith are in our midweek small groups, and they're starting up this coming week. They'll currently meet online via Zoom and are open for anyone on the journey of faith in Jesus, whether you're just investigating or you've been walking that way for many years. There are currently 3 what we call fuse groups starting on Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday evenings, and you can find out more details on our website at nlcletchworth.co.uk/fused. Now, the reason we call them fuse groups, well, fused has 2 meanings: to be joined together and an electrical safety device. And these really apply to our groups: a place to belong and to be known, and a place of safety. So I really encourage you to go and check those out and considering joining one of those this coming week. Well, I do hope that you'll join us again next Sunday for part 2, 9:30 a.m. for our Superstars content and 10:20 for our live stream. Thank you so much for your patience with us getting set up again this morning. Hopefully we'll be a bit closer to that normal start time again next Sunday. But make sure you take some moments to listen for God's voice this week. So take care and God bless you.